public transit access to the outdoors, safe routes to school, and slow and shared streets. She sees active transportation as crucial into creating environmentally and socially healthy communities and draws from her professional experience. Her service within the leadership is AmeriCorps and her everyday car-free life. Joe Broach has over 15 years of experience in transportation research and planning in both academic and agency setting. His work in active transportation modeling, behavior, and data has been widely published and included in federal guidance. Joe's current role include transportation modeling at Portland Metro, research and teaching at Portland State University, and project management of ODOT's statewide travel survey. Then we have Robert, Robert Spurlock, who is a principal regional trail planner with Metro's Park and Nature Department and serves on the Oregon Recreation Trail Advisory Council. He has 20 years of experience in parks and urban planning fields. He was born and raised in Portland and holds a degree in geography and urban studies from Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. And then we have Camilla Dartnell, who is a consultant with Skills and Associates, and she specializes in active transportation planning, data analysis, and conceptual design. This goal is of improving the sustainability, health, and livability of the places she works. Camilla pairs spatial data analysis to identify where facilities are most needed and can make the greatest impact with thoughtful community engagement to develop community-based solutions. Okay. Yeah.
Or you're going to stand first, right?
Yes.
And you can just hit the arrow key.
Okay.
Perfect.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session. Thank you for being here. We have a great session planned for you today with a bunch of really great folks as panelists. We are going to start things off with Metro's Regional Trails Prioritization Tool, and as well as a little overview of the Parks and Nature Bond Measure passed in 2019. Talk about how that money is being allocated for the many trails in the region through a data-driven and an equitable way, and how those two things are coming together. And then after that, we'll transition to talk about Massachusetts and how they underwent a similar process and what we can learn from that. So let's hit the trails. That'll be the only cheesy joke, I swear. Oh no.
Sorry.
Fine.
Good. Okay.
Great, thank you. So hello, and thanks for being here. We did some brief introductions, so I'll just keep us rolling. We have a lot planned for you today, including a lot of these, all these topics that you see here. And so we're just gonna jump right in. Start with an overview of this project. This work to prioritize trails began after the 2019 Parks and Bond Measure was passed. As a refresher, this bond measure had 6 program areas that you can see on the screen here, as well as 3 bond criteria. And I just want to pause and mention that these 3 bond criteria were really important to this bond as well as to this project. These 3 criteria are racial equity, climate resilience, and community engagement. And in case it's not clear, this project focuses on walking and biking trails. What you see here is a map of the regional trail system. It's a pretty extensive system, and if it's a bit hard to see, the solid dark green lines are existing trails, the dashed dark green are planned trails, and the light dashed green are conceptual trails. So like I mentioned, it's a pretty extensive system. If we were to build it all, it would cost over $3 billion, which is not as much as what was in the bond measure. So within that measure, only about 40 million was allocated to trails. So that brings—
It's more than what's in the bond measure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that brings us to the purpose of this project, which was, since the bond measure couldn't fund all of the planned trails, we had to figure out a way to decide which acquisition opportunities to invest in with limited resources. And so by creating this prioritization framework and tool, Metro is able to compare planned regional trail projects to one another to see which best meet the needs of the region's residents. This data-driven process makes it easy to see how projects stack up against one another and how well they speak to community values and to Metro's values. So moving on to community engagement. Metro engaged with community members multiple times throughout this project, including a bit beforehand, actually. And this is important to mention, again, going back to those 3 bond criteria, including community engagement. And that's crucial to recognize because through that bond measure, Metro made a commitment to voters to live up to those values through this work. And this project is a good example of how Metro was able to do that. So, what did we hear? Well, as I mentioned, Metro started engaging with folks even before the bond measure was passed. Back in 2018 and 2019, Metro held a series of open houses, as well as BIPOC-specific events prior to the passage of the bond measure. And from that, those engagement opportunities, Metro and Tool Design used that input to develop a series of prioritization factors by which to measure and score every regional trail within the region. So what you see here is a list of what we heard from community members. And this input directly fed into the development of our prioritization factors. We heard that people wanted trails that were close to home, connected to transit, as well as filling gaps. They also wanted trails that connected to nature and to water, as well as trails that were accessible for the elderly and persons with disabilities. So that's what we heard. Next, I'll pass it off to Joe.
So I'm going to take you through a little bit of the technical analysis that went into building these measures. And so kind of as Kerry set it up, the idea wasn't to do this standalone quantitative technical analysis, but the community engagement fed into developing this analysis that provided some more information. Hopefully it was going to teach us something we didn't already know. And then it fed back out, and Robert's going to tackle that part of helping us interpret the results that we did see and refine them for the future. So I want to get a couple of terms out of the way for those not familiar. One of our important equity tools at Metro in the region is the idea of equity focus areas. And it's a fairly broad concept and definition, but with some nuance, with some idea that there's intersectionality in some of these equity dimensions. And so an equity focus area, simply put, is an area that has higher than regional average concentrations of any one of these 3 groups, but of course they can overlap: people of color, English language learners, and people in lower income groups. And so that fed into several of the measures and analyses, and was also just kind of an overarching frame for sort of helping us to score and interpret them. So I'm going to take you through each of these 6 major categories of prioritization factors. Some of them, based on input we got, ended up being split into multiple sort of measures within the same categories, but those are neighborhood demographics, access to nature, transportation potential, gap completion, connectivity to destinations, and traffic safety. And you'll notice these tie back to those regional priorities that Kerry mentioned already in terms of equity, climate resilience, and also access to nature. So I want to take a moment, and this is a neat full circle oats moment, because it was, gosh, it's been a number of years. It might have been 10 years ago that I was on a panel at Oats talking about the potential for network analysis to inform active transportation planning and advocacy. That was something we wanted to get this powerful tool that had been used on the motorized side and bring it in. And there were several of us on the panels doing some really early work on, and some of that work ended up feeding into what became the regional bicycle travel model and network that underlies a lot of this research. So it's kind of cool to be back at Oats and see this forum still thriving. Sometimes the payoff is long down the road, but here's an application from an initial idea that was kicked around a panel here, so that's cool. But I think a lot of you by now, this used to be a bigger sell and an aha moment, but I think both of us now understand that it's not just about proximity, it's about access, right? And so almost all of these measures to some extent rely on this very detailed regional walking and bicycle network that we maintain for the region. And so most of the measures are going to be based on a network accessibility to a trail. So it's a little hard to make out in this light, but the idea is just because there's a trail here doesn't mean that all of these households have access to it, right? There are specific network access points. The yellow are streets that aren't very comfortable to walk or bike. The green streets are. And you see there's only an access point here or there. And those of you familiar with the spring water know exactly where this area is. And so that just saying you're within a quarter-mile air distance doesn't necessarily serve the community that's adjacent to it. So just so you know, most of these measures are built on that. And it's an important example of kind of why do we maintain these things? Sometimes you get questions of, do we really need a network that detailed? And for analysis like this, yeah, you really do. If you're not pretty close to trail access, you really don't have access to that trail without having to drive or something else. So launching into some of the measures then. Our first one is completely equity focused, and that's measuring to what extent that both trail gap projects and the trails themselves connect to these communities of interest in the equity focus areas. And we further prioritize where there was a stacking of these dimensions. So more points were scored when you had those equity focus areas with people of color, limited English proficiency, and low income. And you can imagine the other combinations of groups in kind of a hierarchy. And these were all measured. So we did this one in the end pretty tight. So this was measured within a quarter-mile to the trail access point. So the idea is that you need to be able to have an easy walk to the trail for it to, to really maximize value to a community. Another important important motivation for completing the trail network is to expand access to natural areas in the region. And here, it's interesting to sort of think about there. You can imagine two different potential projects, and one is providing access to neighborhoods that formerly didn't have any access to natural areas or had very limited, and another that's providing access to those that already have quite a bit of access. And so we wanted to balance those two things. And so the measure gives a higher scoring mark to areas that are newly connected to natural areas. So if they already had a connection to a natural area, we kind of discounted that, right? So that you didn't play into sort of the rich get richer phenomenon with access to trails. This one, Robert will talk a little bit more about this one. This is an interesting one that came out directly out of the community engagement, I'd say, and we created a separate sub-measure for access to nature that was just focused on access to recreational water bodies in the region, rivers and streams. I think it's what we end up using. And the reason that was directly driven by community input from some of our focus groups that told us that this was really important. This is really important for families to be able to access, particularly lower income and non-white families in the region, really made use of this resource and wanted trails that ran nearby or accessed the regional water resources for recreation. And this one was measured a little bit differently. This was, so, there are two ways that a trail can kind of connect. It can get you to like a recreation area that's adjacent to a water body, or it can just pass by. It can kind of be part of the experience of the trail. So this one was measured in kind of a floating corridor along the trail or the project to see if there was water nearby. And this one, it might stand out as a little jarring to you. And sometimes we think about trails just from the access to nature or experiential perspective, but in our region, trails also serve the purpose of increasing the options of sustainable travel. And so we also wanted a measure of transportation potential, as long as, you'll see a little bit later, access to destinations. This one is an interesting case too. Like I said, this is built on work that's been going on for at least 10 years in the region to build a regional bicycle behavior model that's sensitive to things like trails. So when you add a trail, you expect that people will shift to consider that trail as part of their trip, and that will encourage people to bicycle more. You notice I'm saying bicycling because we don't yet have that capability at a regional modeling scale for walking and pedestrian trips. I'll be back here in 10 years to tell you about how we succeeded with that. I hope now, hopefully sooner. But what we did is we ran the regional travel model with and without these potential gaps filled in. And then we looked at the maximum transportation potential measured as the expected number of bicyclists along that trail. And you can see sort of some pictographic results there that then got scored on transportation potential. And this is a good, this is a good little moment to pause too and say that you should think about this as a menu of options of measuring these things and think in your own work about picking and choosing. This is not a formula, that has to be filled in exactly the same as here. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, you can't do this. We don't have a regional bike travel model where I work or where I'm from or whatever. But as Camilla is going to present later, there are lots of opportunities. This was built intentionally to be modular and flexible so that you could substitute methods in as capabilities change or different in different places. You could shift the scoring or the measures based on your priorities changing or what's important to the groups that you're trying to reflect change. So, I think we saw it as being flexible going forward too. This was not like a one and done and we're going to apply it rigidly in the future. It's going to continue to adapt as capabilities and needs change. Gap completion, obvious one. This is about funding gaps in the regional trail network. And you can imagine kind of 3 cases, right? And we wanted to be sure to prioritize trails that leverage the network to get the most for the bond dollars. So if you imagine just a trail off by itself, a brand new trail, that's great, but it's not leveraging the existing regional trail network. You can imagine like that second case where it maybe connects to the end of an existing trail and extends it. That's better, right? And in the best case, or the biggest multiplier effect is going to be when it connects to segments of trail and ties parts of the whole system together. And so we scored based on how much trail was contiguous after the project versus before, subtracted out that orange part of the project, and that kind of gives you a measure of its network impact. And we also, we saw these cases. It's interesting when a trail just meanders through a park, right? It's a very nice experience, but from a kind of geographic coverage perspective, it may be not adding as much as a shorter project that's more direct and connects segments of the network. And so a meandering trail will overlap a lot in the area that it kind of covers. And so we kind of measured in a buffer around how much new geographic area was covered after the gap was filled in. And then connectivity destinations, I'm going to let Robert talk about how those destinations were decided. It's not easy, right, to build a market basket of like important community destinations. And this is a case where you're probably not going to get there just through the data or analysis. You've got to hear from people, and particularly groups that you don't always hear from, things that might surprise you. So we built an initial basket. It could change over time. And we also added an equity kind of layer onto this. We measured first just how much did it expand access to this key set of destinations. And then we looked at the proportion of that expansion that went to the equity focus areas versus to the non-equity focus areas to understand, even if a project added a lot of destinations, if it wasn't equity improving, the score would be sort of discounted based on that factor so that we'd prioritize equity. And finally, there's a safety component that's very important priority for our region, making the transportation system safer, particularly for vulnerable road users and groups. And we measured this in the end in 2 different ways. And I thought they were very, I really liked where they ended up. It's a pretty complicated topic, to talk about a trail that has greater safety potential, but we measured in 2 ways. One was if it parallels for a specified distance, an existing dangerous road, and those were our high injury network and barrier streets and facilities. If it paralleled that, then it scored extra points because the the idea was the existing option to connect two pieces of trail or to a destination would be more dangerous. It would give you a better, safer option. And secondly, it's not just about paralleling, it's about bridging those barrier or dangerous facilities. So things like freeways, railroad grades, even water bodies are barriers, right, to active travel. And so to the extent that it crossed one of those barriers, it created a new crossing of those barriers, scored additional points. And now I believe it's time to hand over to Robert to tell you how we made sense of that. Yeah, that's a lot of measures that I didn't get into the details, but yeah, turn it over to Robert. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Joe. Hey, everyone. So it's important to remember a point that Kerry made earlier about the criteria for the bond measure for Metro Council and the direction from council to lead with racial equity in all this work and to build in community engagement into every step. So Kerry mentioned that there was engagement work specific to Black, Indigenous, and people of color that we conducted leading up to the vote. The region's voters voted in November of 2019. And that kind of set us on the path of what these measures and criteria were going to be. But it was time to do more engagement through this project. And so I was really inspired by a quote that I heard, by a presentation I heard at Oates in 2020. I think the topic was on teens and transit, and I think it was like in LA maybe, but I can't remember who the speaker was, but it really stuck with me. She said that holding an open house or creating an engagement space and saying you are welcome here or all are welcome here is not the same as saying we designed this and created this space specifically for you. So we really took that to heart. That was kind of our guiding principle, and the success that we had with kind of non-white targeted engagement from before the bond. And because really, when you think about it, if you're just saying all are welcome here and having an open house for a general audience, it's at the end of the day, that's still just a white space. So with that in mind, for this next round of engagement, we created it specifically for non-white folks. And we had 2 online forums. We had 100 folks attend, and less than a handful were white. So I was there. I was one of those, not one of the few white folks. So I do think we succeeded in creating that kind of non-dominant culture space. So, and that kind of has to do with why we're doing this whole project in the first place. I think the traditional way of prioritizing investments, like we've had past bond measures that have had funding for trails or other funding sources that go toward trails, often it's just serving the loudest voices. If anyone attended the session yesterday afternoon, Bend was talking about pedestrian network prioritization. That was the impetus for their project too, making sure that it's not just the loudest voices that are determining which projects get funded. So this was our attempt to kind of do things differently and have a paradigm shift. So Joe explained all of these data-driven factors and measures that we used. But the engagement events that we held at that point in the project were the opportunity to get direct, to insert racial equity in a couple of direct ways. So first of all, ask the community how some of these factors that Joe alluded to can be specifically tweaked to be kind of the most responsive to community's desires. For example, like what types of natural areas and parks, and I'll get into that. But then second, and this is really the primary way that engagement informed this work, was which of those factors are the most important and should therefore be weighted differently. So on the question of which natural areas, so we have a Parks to Natural Areas GIS layer, and it includes this attribute with these different values. So There was a clear break in the responses. So basically we just included the top 4 types of parks and natural areas and didn't include the others. And then on the water bodies question, there wasn't really a clear break. So we included all the types of water bodies in our GIS data. For the types of destinations, this list came from originally all the extensive outreach that Metro did for I think it was called Get Moving 2020, the failed 2020 transportation measure. That was our starting place. And then we asked which destinations were more important. Well, there were 2 breaks here. So we did a tier 1 that kind of got weighted higher, and then a tier 2, and then didn't include the bottom ones. So asking the community to weigh in on which of these factors were more important. This is the order of how the community prioritized these factors. These top 2, neighborhood demographics and access to nature, this tracked perfectly, totally the same as all of the qualitative BIPOC engagement that we'd done previously. So that really made sense. It just kind of confirmed what we thought was going to be the case. The access to water topic is just extremely popular, really, with everyone, like general audience included. But these other ones, we weren't really sure how that was going to shake out. So that influenced how we ended up prioritizing all of these potential projects. Just back quickly to the, I just want to go back again to this idea of creating this non-white space. I just think it was so key to the success of this project and to our work in general. So you'll see in the graph that there isn't a choice for 2 or more races, and 7 of the participants were white folks. Well, we just asked people to select all that applies. So those folks were in fact mixed race. And it was an optional question, so we actually only got 44 respondents, but we have some really good qualitative results of these engagement events that I would really encourage everyone to check out. It's available on our website, oregonmetro.gov/trails, pretty easy to remember. And so we just got a lot of open-ended feedback around designing and creating trails that were responsive to the needs and desires of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And it was very clear that obviously that's not a monolithic group of people. I think it's easy. People like to use the acronym because it's much easier to say, but that maybe might lend to the misconception that like all non-white people have the same experience, which is of course not true at all. And this summary that's on our webpage really draws that out, I think, really effectively. So if you want to dive deeper into that, all of that feedback from the engagement, I think the summary is about 7 pages long. So it's short but sweet. It's really dense with good stuff. So we definitely, first and foremost, we heard that there was a lot of appreciation and support of this approach of centering Black, Indigenous, and people of color and creating that non-white space. So that's something that we continue to do in our work. And then the conversation, like I said, the conversations just provided so much kind of rich nuance around people's lived experience. And so some of the things that we pulled out from that, there's so many themes that emerge that are all in that report. So again, check it out. I'm not going to go through all of it right now, but like 3 of the top themes that emerged are prioritize making sure that the trail itself feels welcoming and safe for people of color. And that's very complex. That can look different, especially if you're a man or a woman. And so we kind of dive into that a little bit in the report. And then projects need to honor Indigenous people and the land and history and culture and traditions. That was very clear. And then investment should focus on communities who don't have immediate access to trails or other natural spaces. So Joe kind of spoke to that a little bit. Yeah, just one more plug to go to oregonmetro.gov/trails and check out that report. I think I just skipped a slide by accident. All right, I have 2 more slides. So when it comes to combining scores, this slide is supposed to be visually overwhelming. That was intentional. It's supposed to convey that it's a lot of data. I mean, we had 250 discrete trail segments. We actually had a few more than that, 250 and change. And those could have been anywhere from a couple blocks long to up to maybe a mile long would have been our longest segments. And then there are the 6 factors, but really those factors were aggregates of several discrete measures. So we really had more like a dozen or more things that we were measuring for each of those 250 plus segments. So it got really overwhelming really fast, but we had awesome consultants and Joe to make it sense of it, but it really quickly became a very technical exercise once again. And the results, this is once we combined those 6 maps on the previous slide, we got this map. So we basically just have 3 tiers, which you can see in the table and on the map. Sorry that we didn't match the color scheme. I should probably remake the map to match, but I'm going to tell you really quickly about what surprised us and what we learned, and then I'm going to turn it over to Camilla. So there were some new trails that we hadn't been focused on at all that we're now focused on. So the Beaverton Creek Trail really popped out. We hadn't been focused on that before. The I-84 path here, some of you might be familiar with this in East Portland. There's a gap right there. That really popped out in the analysis. That kind of surprised us. And then all of this Halsey and Salish Ponds stuff in Wood Village and Fairview, that scored really well too. On kind of conversely, other end of the spectrum, we had been really focused on the Ice Age Tonkin Trail in Wilsonville and Sherwood and parts of Twelton. We're de-emphasizing that now because of this work, not as focused on that anymore. And those cities are still focused on it and they're doing a great job. So maybe Metro's resources can go to some of the cities that don't have the resources that Wilsonville and Twelton and Sherwood have. So I was not expecting the stuff in Happy Valley and kind of far southeast Portland to perform so well. Incidentally, Metro had already been making investments out here because of the conservation potential in the East Buttes. So I was surprised to see it perform so well in the analysis. In terms of which ones we were already working on that were reaffirmed, there was no surprise. Council Creek Trail popped out. And then it was really gratifying to see that all of the time and money we've been putting into North Portland Greenway, Columbia Slough, Marine Drive, Gresham Fairview Trail, that's all been kind of like reaffirmed. Those are still priorities. One other result that shouldn't be too surprising, anything on the periphery of the region didn't score too well. The Forest Grove, Emerald Necklace, the Oregon City Loop Trail. A lot of these measures just have to do with where there are a lot of people. And that's okay. Like that's what the values are from the community engagement, from Metro Council. So this just helps us kind of defend those investments. So we all had to go through this presentation pretty quickly because there were a lot of details we didn't skip over, but I hope that the takeaway was that this was just our attempt, and I think we succeeded in achieving equitable outcomes that center people of color through both robust engagement with people of color, but also with really objective data analysis at the same time, and just kind of marrying those two. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Camilla. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I feel like I want to follow up with you afterwards. I've got a list of questions. So if no one else has questions in the audience, then can definitely take that time. So we will have a period for questions, I think, at the very end. And so if you do have questions for our 3 presenters so far, put them in your back pocket right now. Thanks. So I'm going to be talking about something very similar, but I'm going to be talking about a little bit of a different spin on it. And I'm going to be talking about a little bit of a different focus within it. So we've been going through a very similar process for Massachusetts Department of Transportation, and specifically a multi-agency team within Massachusetts called Mass Trails. And with that, then one thing that we've been trying to figure out is lends itself really well to what we just heard about, the transportation potential criteria that was used in Metro's modeling efforts that we just learned about. And so I'm going to do a little bit of a deeper dive on just our exploration and some of our findings here and how we've been able to apply that. I'll first talk about why we want to estimate demand, and then I'll jump into kind of an overview of how our project has gone, and then some of the results that has led us to. So first of all, why do we want to estimate demand in the first place? There's a number of different reasons, and I could go on and on about all of the reasons why we want biped volumes in general, especially, on our roadways as well. But we were really focused on trails specifically, and some of the things that we know that they could be really useful for, really applicable for, are prioritization, like you just heard about. Which trails are having the biggest impacts to their communities right now, and what are those lessons learned that we can apply to future trails? What types of trail characteristics are associated with higher use and why? And then where should new trail projects be recommended? So, when you look at a map like what we were just looking at for Metro, we're looking at that for the state of Massachusetts, and they have a vision network, a priority vision network across the state as well. Then are there areas where they don't have any, even potential dotted lines on the map that we should be considering adding those? And then there's also some kind of nitty-gritty details that would be really nice to be able to know beforehand, like how wide should a trail be once we do get into that project development stages. So these are some of the questions that kept coming up. And specifically, then MassDOT was starting to undergo a prioritization effort. And they had a number of tools available, and they were trying to understand, with the tools that they had available, what can we learn from this? And just generally speaking, for many jurisdictions, including MassDOT, then there really aren't actually that many tools in the quiver for understanding biking and walking volumes right now. You might have some, if you're lucky, you might have some count data, right, that can help inform some things. It's probably not going to be comprehensive. You might have some sort of a transportation model that might start to predict some demand, but unless you're Metro, apparently, with this really sensitive model specifically for biking, which is super incredible, which MassDOT does not have, then it doesn't take into consideration trails. It doesn't take into consideration things like where are there actually facilities and what is the stress of those facilities. And so it's really inadequate, quite frankly, for measuring walking and biking. So that's where we came into play. Essentially, we were working with Mass Trails, and they said, hey, we have a couple of data sets. Can you just see how far you can get this? Let's just see, because we have all of these questions. Can you use our data that we already have without going out and getting new data to help answer some things? And so really, this exploration and testing should go across this whole thing, because we got to this first stage and we were like, okay, yeah, we're starting to get some results that we can actually apply. And that's really exciting and really fun. And then there were a couple of rural applications and rural questions. And so we went a little bit farther and we said, what are the differences in rural and urban? And can we figure out potential demand on future trails, right? In rural areas too. And then we took it that one step farther and said, okay, let's take a step back. Is this something that we could apply to that entire vision network that Mass Trails has to understand, the potential demand on each of these future trails? And so that's where we get into statewide screening. And so I'll talk about the difference of these now. So for those first two that I was mentioning, the urban and rural applications, we're really talking about much more context specific, trail specific, zoomed in, where we are thinking about, what are we connecting to? What are the destinations? Things like that. When we're talking about the statewide screening, then we're not accounting for all of those specific context differences. It's really what type of a very high level screening can we do to just get us, relative differences in trail use. The data that they had available so that we could kind of play with and figure out throughout the process was these existing and future trail geometries. They had a streetlight data account, and so that was something that we had access to and was really useful for this process. They had about 5 or 6 permanent counters, and these are actually counters that we set up on trails about 5 years ago. So yay for pre-COVID and post-COVID data for a different project. So that was something that was nice to have access to. And then, just some other general data sets that are pretty common and that you can get access to, like key destinations, population, and we use building density in rural areas just because walk groups and whatnot become a lot larger. So as we're going through this, a couple things to keep in mind and a couple things that we learned through the process. We all of these got us to a level where we didn't feel like there was a super high level of accuracy within any of these estimates, but they ended up being very useful for planning level applications. So keep that in mind. And then actually something that came up in the last presentation too was biking versus walking volumes. And that was something that we didn't find that streetlights walking data was accurate enough and was robust enough, et cetera, for us to feel comfortable using it on those project by project like applications through this process. What we did end up doing for the statewide screening, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later, is we found that biking plus walking volumes together actually did get us to a higher level of accuracy. And so, we didn't end up differentiating walking from biking in the statewide screening, and we only were focused on biking for these location specific projects, I guess. So jumping into this project level estimation, I just mentioned, we went in, we looked at all this data, we were really just testing out what are these different characteristics. If a trail is longer, then what are the differences in volume that we're seeing between that and a very similar trail in a very similar area, normalized for population density, things like that, so that we could try and understand some of those changes. And so some of the key findings coming out of that, which many of them are very intuitive, which is great, don't be afraid of simplicity, is first of all, these volumes were highly correlated with population near the trail. It makes a lot of sense, and it was ended up being really great for our process and in terms of building a process for estimating demand. Biking volumes at one location tend to be similar to adjacent trail segments. Again, nothing that's too mind-blowing here, but also very useful. Average trip lengths tend to increase on longer trails. And something else that we found here is that longer trails actually attract people as well. And so this is started to differentiate, not just in how long people were going on trails, but the number of people who were using these trails. And then in urban areas, key destinations were yielding higher demand, as you might expect. And then in rural areas, something that was pretty interesting is that high quality, specifically high quality connections between communities yield higher demand. And so if you have, you've got a trail that's 10 miles long and it gets you into the downtown of one community, and then you can bike all the way into the downtown of another community, we were seeing extremely different results from that to a 9-mile long trail in the same situation that took you from the downtown of one community to a mile short of the downtown in the next community, right? So these were some results that became really important to building our process. So what is this process that we built? And I will say that it did end up actually varying a bit. And again, this speaks directly to the last presentation, but it did end up varying a bit based on whether or not this was a brand new trail, whether it was a trail extension, or whether or not it completely filled a gap. And so keep that in mind. But just generally speaking, what was our process? It was to establish baseline trips completely based on population density near the trail. So that's number one. Applying that length extension. So how many additional miles and how many additional people are going to be there because you're making this longer or of a certain length. And then what are these additional trips that connect to new destinations? So fairly basic, but again, gets us to a place where we can start to understand what the potential demand is in some locations. So moving into a case study, one of the places where we applied it, and we did end up applying it on a number of locations. And I keep looking at Paulina because she didn't say when she was doing introductions, but she was a very key member of the team, analyzing all of this and figuring this out. And so, in fact, if you have questions, I might even be looking at Paulina to help me answer some of them. But so the Northern Strand extension, just to help provide a bit of context, it's just north of Boston, does not currently connect to Boston, but there are plans in the future for it too. And this extension that we were looking at would essentially double the length of the trail, and it would take it out into Lynn, and it's, a bikeway to the sea. And so again, a connection to a waterway becomes really important when you're thinking about where people want to go and connecting people to place. In addition to getting them to the coast, to this beach, then it also goes to a couple other key destinations that we kept in mind, like a key transit center in the region. So how did we apply this? First of all, we just looked at, what's baseline? Like, what is our existing data telling us the current number of trips are? And so we got those bike trips, and we got distance for just existing length of the current trail for the Northern Strand. Then we looked at this extension and we said, okay, what is that next new baseline based on the additional population within a buffer of our trail? And you can see, that over doubles the number of trips that we were expecting just right then and there, which makes a lot of sense because we're extending it about 2 times the distance. And then we made that adjustment, like I talked about, of not just number of miles, but also the number of bike trips we were expecting to see because we were making the trail longer. And then we came up with a process of, again, all of this is just based on looking at similar trails in the area and doing comparisons and trying to understand, how much are we actually inducing demand for people to be using these facilities to get to places. And so that's where we were able to come up with our new connections to destinations. And streetlight data does allow you, to be able to only look at the number of trips. We were able to do things like look at the number of trips that were low mileage trips that were already taking a similar route to what our trail would be able to provide. And so that's how we're able to kind of narrow down and make estimations about these new connections to destinations. So we ended up doing that for a number of urban trails. We did that for a number of rural trails, and I talked about some of the differences between the urban and rural methodologies. And then that's where we took that step back and said, okay, how would we apply this statewide, or just if we were able to look at all of the trails across the state, or all of these key trails across the state and look at their demand right now, then does that give us any trends, or does that give us any indication of what future trail demand might be? Again, all of this at a very high level. So we looked at data for 19 different trails across the state. We just came up with a regression line and said, based on population density only, right? So we're losing some of the granularity that we had already established in this last round. But based on population density, are we seeing any sort of trend that can be applied statewide? And what does this look like? And does it make sense to apply this further? So we did start to see some trends, and then we also started to understand, there's some outliers, and why are these outliers the way that they are, et cetera. And what we established is that, some of these outliers are, I'm going to say names of trails that I don't at all expect you to know, but you might know the Minuteman, because everyone knows the Minuteman because it is a really well established trail. It's well used. It connects to transit. It's a suburban trail that connects people into Boston, very well used. And so we're like, okay, why is the Minuteman coming up as so much better, right, than some of these other trails? Why is the Northern Strand not coming up as well? And so what we established is that there are just higher performing trails. There's going to be your middle performing trails and your low performing trails. And some of that is going to be based on, how long has this been around? How good is the access to it? Really everything that you've already heard about, right? And so if you've got a newer trail that doesn't connect to as many things, it doesn't connect to transit currently, it doesn't get you to places, but maybe it will in the future, then, it's probably in that lower performing band. If you have one that is the opposite, all of that, probably in that higher performing band. And then we had a lot that were more middle performing. And my graphics are messing up a little bit here, so I apologize for that. I don't know why that's happening, but so how have we been able to apply this now since then? We've been helping MassDOT update their STIP evaluation. And so really this is in the past when they were looking at their STIP and where they were going to be allocating statewide funds for transportation purposes, then they lumped all of the projects together, right? Trail projects and roadway projects and bridge projects and whatnot were all lumped together into and compared against all of the same criteria. And because this process was established many decades ago, then trail projects were always coming up really, really low. And so this is something that we've helped them kind of open up and make changes to over the last, year or so. And with that, then we were able to include this demand estimation as a criteria within their STIP evaluation, which is, a brand new thing for them. So let's see. And it is balanced with other criteria, like you just heard about, very similar criteria to what Metro is using, like equity and access and safety and whatnot. And so that's why I want to pick these folks' brains about how you're applying some of this, because we're going through some of this right now. So I think that is it. So yeah, I'll just pause, and if y'all want to come up, and then we can, do you want to moderate questions and we can go from there? Or if folks just want to,
we don't have a microphone, so probably.
oh yeah, if folks just want to raise your hand, you can, but maybe we might need an extra chair. Yeah, great. Yeah, absolutely, in the back.
Well, great presentation. Thanks, Joe, for talking about this. One question I had with Metro team, as far as how is the project engaging and including community members that are facing homelessness? I was curious how demographic data was able to include those folks, and also what type of individual outreach or engagement.
Yeah, great question. So we, it was an attempt to include those folks in the same general audience engagement that we conducted. Was I didn't really have time to go over the general audience work. I just focused on the blind images full color. But I don't know, I'll be honest, like we definitely could have stepped up our game there because it just takes a lot of extra effort to get to spread the word to houseless folks experiencing houselessness and get them to show up. So didn't really get a lot of participation, but we did get, and if you look at that summary that I keep plugging that's on our website, we did get a lot of input from especially the non-white engagement work around basically asking or suggesting that we engage directly with folks experiencing houselessness. So we just still need to follow up on that. We haven't done that yet. So more work to come on that.
It's our agency working, again, it's for others are doing this, kind of what I'm trying to.
Yeah, we should talk more.
That also reminds me of a point I don't think I mentioned, but the time horizons for these sort of planning exercises are really something to pay attention to. We're planning for the future, but we're using data often from either from right now or from different points in time. So we were using a future network, so it was taking into account like what we were planning to build in the next 25 years in the region, what the potential of that trail would be within that future network. But like our equity focus layers and our destinations that we're layering on top are present day. And those might shift. Obviously, we know, through from displacement and gentrification that you build in an area to serve a community that then shifts. And the houseless population is maybe the extreme example of that.
Mhm.
If you try to serve the needs where they are today, that might not be the same next week or next month even, unless there's some more organization. So I think these issues of time horizon, just like it took us a long time to get from just pro-fly buffers around our projects to network analysis. I think now we're starting to grapple with the idea that these future years have a lot of uncertainty and are putting too fine a point sometimes on who's there right now where we're building it versus who's going to be there right in 20 years or over the life of a project.
Yeah, that reminded me that another detail that we didn't spend any time on at all, I don't even think I mentioned it, but we heard a lot of input from the community around concerns over gentrification and displacement. So that was part of Tool Design's contract with us, was to do a literature review on all the academic research around the relationship between trails and gentrification and displacement. So that literature review, that's a resource that's also available at the same URL. You can check that out, but it's a concern that's high on folks' minds because displacement is real and it is happening. The question of whether trails lead to displacement, the literature doesn't support that, but there are a few examples, like really expensive, high design level trails, like is it called the 808 in Chicago? Okay, I knew it was. I knew it was a palindrome. And the High Line and the Belt Line in Atlanta. So people hear about that and then they think it's all trails, but then when you look at spring water, it could be the exact opposite of gentrification that's happening. So how can those two things be true at once? Like because you go to an open house about trails and the NIMBYs show up and they all say that trails decrease property value. And then you go to an open house with a bunch of folks who live next to the High Line and they say that trails increase property value. So I think both are true. But if you want to know more about it, you can read the report that Tool developed on it.